Hi everyone, welcome back to episode 5 of a series that's looking at Steven Pinker's book Enlightenment Now, which is all about the progress that humanity has made over the past 250 years. So far we've looked at progress that has been made in the lifespan and the health of human beings. This episode we're going to look at sustenance. And Pinker tells a pretty familiar story by now, just the huge advances that science and technology has brought on over the past few centuries in this area. And we've already seen how this goes in terms of increases in life expectancy, in terms of decreases in illness and disease. But in those previous 2 episodes where we've looked at those things, we can still ask various questions. So if you can recall, just to recap, when it comes to life expectancy, the dramatic increases in life expectancy has really created a mental shift in our lives where we've gone from thinking of ourselves primarily in terms of mortal and limited and vulnerable. We are now seeing more in terms of life being full of opportunity. All problems can be solved. All suffering can be alleviated, and this switch really is one from thinking primarily of our lives and the world in terms of instrumental value. We can do stuff with almost everything we can see, including ourselves. We become tools, objects that can be used and manipulated to improve things, and this does make things better, but at what cost? To what extent do we stop seeing life in terms of ways in which we can improve things, stop seeing ourselves in terms of what we can do, stop seeing others, natural ecosystems, non-human animals in terms of what they can do for us, and think about what is intrinsically valuable. Likewise, when we looked at the field of health and the huge advances we've made in terms of healthcare, we looked at a grander notion of health, one that didn't just include physical health, but included emotional and spiritual health. And we can accept everything Pinker's saying without necessarily being confident that the huge amount of progress we've seen in terms of our physical health will apply to this broader notion of health. Can we simply give someone a pill or a series of therapy in order to give them a sense of emotional or spiritual health, a sense of mental and emotional well-being? Again, I think that this deeper sense of meaning and connection in our lives actually comes from the opposite way in which we're encouraged to view the world through the lens of modernity. Instead of seeing the world as things we can control to make stuff better, a deep sense of meaning and fulfillment instead comes from seeing the world as it is and thinking things as intrinsically valuable and caring about them, the relationships that make up our lives that are inherently out of our control. So we can ask these questions, and we're going to repeatedly be asking these kind of questions, which is basically agreeing with everything Pinker said about the huge amount of progress we've made over the past few centuries, but from the perspective of the past, present and future, still ask whether we can do better. So from the perspective of the past, has the progress we've made significantly accounted for injustices of the past, like slavery and colonialism? In terms of the present, has all the huge amounts of progress we've made in terms of gaining resources and opportunities actually translated into a deep sense of meaning and connection? And in terms of the future, has all the progress we made, is it likely to continue? Is it sustainable in light of various existential threats that we face, or increasing social complexities and inequalities? And I think we can see a similar thing in terms of sustenance. So let's turn to that now. As usual, Pinker highlights the tremendous amount of progress that has been made since the 18th century. He references Robert Fogle's book, The Escape from Hunger and Premature Death, 1700 to 2100, where he shows that the energy value of a typical diet in France at the start of the 18th century was as low as it was in Rwanda in 1965, which was the most malnourished nation for that year. Pinker shows that in 1965, 35% of people in the developing world were undernourished. That figure is now 13%, which is obviously still way too high, but a significant improvement, especially once we consider the extent to which the population has grown in that time period. That's a lot more people being fed. Pinker puts these improvements largely down to advances in agriculture, in particular the mechanization of production of food, as well as the storage and transport of food. It means that we have industrial farming, which produces food at scale with significantly lower labour costs. So some examples of this, the amount of food that can be bought with an hour's worth of labour now in comparison to at the beginning of the 20th century. So in 1901, an hour's wages could buy a pound of butter, but now it can buy 5 pounds. We can now buy 12 dozen eggs for the same price that it would have cost to buy 1 dozen eggs in 1901. We can buy 49 pounds of flour for the price of 9 pounds over a century ago. So these reductions all add up. Famine used to be endemic to Asia and Europe. Countries like China, Russia, India, Bangladesh used to be labelled the land of famine. That just doesn't exist anymore. It's kind of hard for us to grasp our head around that, but really now there are only a few regions in the world, such as Ethiopia and Sudan, that still have famine. Again, that's still too much, right? We should strive to make famine a thing of history, but this is exactly Pinker's point. We are heading in that direction and have been for the past few centuries. So this is great. This is a wonderful story. I love telling this story. That's why I really love this series. But as usual, Pinker typically doesn't dwell so much on the negative unintended consequences and externalities of these improvements. So industrial farming is far from straightforward. He doesn't talk about the nutritional problems associated with it. He doesn't talk about the problems it has for climate change. For example, according to one estimate from the UN, we only have about 50 to 60 harvests left until the Earth's topsoil has been degraded and this sort of farming becomes untenable. Industrial farming is partly responsible for 20% of the Amazon rainforest that has been lost over the past 50 years, sorry. Much of this deforestation is due to livestock farming, which is often intensive and cruel. We now kill 74 billion animals a year globally. Is that progress? It's very, very hard to keep that argument up. But putting those arguments, those tricky moral arguments aside, I think the most interesting question is, where do we go from here? And this is where I think Pinker only delivers half the story. In highlighting the tremendous improvements we've made, I think his answer is likely, we'll do more of the same. More mechanization, which makes industrial farming more efficient, creates less land use, less labor time, and also innovations in things like genetically modified crops, plant-based proteins, that kind of thing. I think that could well be true, but to me it seems like we can do better than that. The whole point of having made all this progress is we can afford to do things in ways that address some of the wider issues associated with agriculture, its impact on nutrition, its impact on the environment. So we can do things like small-scale, predominantly plant-based, environmentally regenerative agricultural practices, and we can try and do that as much as possible. We can we can think, we've got to this stage in development where we can begin to make these choices of investing in the things that matter, rather than just making more and more progress. We can ask ourselves, what kind of progress do we want to make now? We have the luxury of being able to ask that question. Who do we want to make progress for? We have the ability to ask that question too. And if we can't begin now, after having made all this progress, to make more sustainable, more compassionate forms of progress, then when will we be able to do that? And so, just on a personal note, I've been over the past couple of years becoming a part-time baker and wheat farmer alongside all the writing, and I'm under no pretense that those efforts will feed the world, let alone my local community. They're very again, small scale farming practices. It's time intensive sourdough baking, not the kind of efficient processes that has provided us with all the progress that Pinker points out in this chapter. But this is what I've chosen to do with all the opportunities and resources that I've gained through being the recipient of all this progress that we've made. I can think of nothing better to do with all these advances than to feed people in my local community in ways that are nutritious and help restore the natural environment. Is this the most efficient thing I can do? Will this produce the greatest amount of good for humanity? Probably not. But with all the resources and all the opportunities we have, in addition to kind of maximizing what is useful, we can also now, I believe, afford to do what we believe is right, what is meaningful, beautiful, and true. And I think that's the other half of the story to Pinker's book. Thanks very much.